Hello, greetings to everyone listening. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sherry Stephenson, a member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group and also a member of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. And joining me today is Hamid Mamdouh, who is Senior Counsel with King and Spalding in Geneva. And as we all know, the former Director of the Trade and Services and Investment Division at the WTO for many years. So we're both pleased to be with you today and to discuss the outcome of the recent WTO 13th Ministerial Conference held last week in Abu Dhabi in the area of services. And this is a part of an interview series being carried out by the Friends of Multilateralism Group. There are 12 interviews in total, and all will be available online on the FMG website. So without further ado, let's go into our topic, our services. If you would permit just a few minutes for me to set the scene for our discussion and to refresh everyone on the importance of services for the world economy and for world trade, since there was not much talk about services, if any at all, prior to the ministerial conference. But in fact, services are really the core of our economy at present. They generate more than 2/3 of global GDP. The services sector employs the largest number of people for most of the world's countries and regions. Services create the most jobs globally. Over 2/3 of foreign direct investment flows go into services activities. And in trade, when measured on a value-added basis, services constitute over 1/2 of global trade. They're also the greatest generator of innovation, and they are the center of our digital transformation. About 55% of services trade now is digitally enabled. So this is very brief, but clearly this gives you a picture of the importance of services, which cannot be doubted. And this growth in the importance of services in all aspects of our economies and our lives is on a constantly upward trajectory. So going back to the WTO and the recent ministerial outcome, in terms of being the first reform ministerial, which many had hoped, MC13 was certainly a disappointment. In most areas, there was indeed no outcome other than an agreement to continue discussions, but other interviews will analyze these areas. However, in my view, and we'll see if Hamid agrees, the recent ministerial has to be commended for 3 big success stories in services. Surprisingly, perhaps to many, in my view, the main substantive outcome of MC13 was actually in the area of services and in 3 big success stories. The first of which was the official certification of 27 revised schedules from 54 WTO members, so that the plurilateral agreement on services domestic regulation is now officially entered into force. And the second major success story is the extension of the e-commerce moratorium with a huge effort for another 2 years. And the third success story is the inclusion in the ministerial declaration of a significant paragraph on services with a commitment by WTO members to reinvigorate the services work under the GATS. So for a ministerial meeting in which very little discussion was carried on per se on services in advance, and for which no negotiating proposals were put on the table, this nonetheless, to me, seems to be a significant outcome. So Hamid, were you also surprised by these positive outcomes for services? And in your mind, how important are they? And perhaps when you address that question, maybe you could also address the question that has puzzled me for many years. And as the former director of the WTO division on services and investment, in your view, why has relatively so little attention been paid to the services area over the last 15 years in the WTO? There have been no negotiating proposals and no major multilateral initiatives relative to services since July 2008. So the only initiatives we've had have been in the form of plurilaterals. In your mind, does this puzzle you as much as it puzzles me? And what are your thoughts on this? Why has the WTO neglected such a vital area of the world economy in its work? Thanks, Hamid. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. This is a really insightful introduction. I think if I may start with your first question about the outcome of MC13, I think it is quite significant that we have those three elements that you rightly mentioned. Were they surprising? I might have a slightly different take, and I'll tell you why. I think for at least two of them, there was a certain degree of inevitability. The certification of schedules on domestic regulation, there was no way this could have been actually blocked in a legally consistent way. Improvements for schedules are something that members of the WTO can do at any time. There are specific agreed procedures for that. The politics of the situation is a different matter, and that actually led some countries, particularly India and South Africa, to object to the certification. But the objection actually was not based on any substantive reasoning. It was purely political. It was bound to drop out. And actually, the withdrawal of the objection by India took place before the ministerial started. So I wouldn't particularly attribute it to the ministerial, but they wanted to do it, but they wanted to do it under the spotlight. So that's the first element. The second element, which wasn't surprising also, was this paragraph on services in the ministerial declaration. And the reason why I find it unsurprising is because there had to be some follow-up on a similar paragraph that came out of MC12. If ministers in MC12 adopted a paragraph saying services, 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 and then we come to the next ministerial and nothing is said about services, then that would be super odd in my view. So there had to be something on services in the declaration. The third element, which is the moratorium, I think it was really touch and go, as we know. But we also know that this is basically like a hostage-taking situation. We've seen this near-death experience several times, repeatedly, since the moratorium was adopted 25 years ago. So was it surprising? Yes and no. So the answer is probably yo, because it's neither yes nor no. But I think the real issue here is what you mentioned in the beginning, Sherry, which is we have those three elements. And going forward, how valuable are these going to be? Now, how important are they? My answer here is that I think they would be basically what we make of them, or what members would make of them, because you can make a lot and you can make very little. Now, they are of different natures, of course. When you think about, okay, which one of them actually has a direct effect on the ground, the only one probably is domestic regulation, because this is what would lead to some regulatory reforms, particularly in countries that need to enhance their transparency and simplify their administrative procedures and improve governance machinery. But for the other two, I think for the paragraph on services, which calls for the reinvigoration of the services agenda, this is basically what members would want to make of it. And for the moratorium, I think what was really interesting this time around is the language of agreeing on the extension of the moratorium had at the end of it a signal that we didn't have before. Not a signal, actually an element we didn't have before, which basically indicates that this is the last extension. So that actually, and perhaps this is a subject for another conversation, this actually sort of prompts a deeper look into the situation of what is the purpose of that moratorium, which is 25 years old, and what new realities do we have now, and what do we need to do beyond that? But that's another conversation. But when it comes to the services agenda, and your second question about why we haven't seen much really, it is quite an institutional question, apart from the importance of services, as you rightly highlighted in the beginning. This system in the GATS was based on an ongoing negotiating machinery. It's embedded in the system. You look at Article 19 of the GATS and says what? That members shall pursue the process of progressive liberalization through successive rounds of negotiations. Successive rounds of negotiations. Now, if you look at the GATS, and if I may just open a parenthesis here, one of the important features of the agreement is that it really has a built-in negotiating machinery that should cater for any kind of eventuality. Why? Because during the drafting of this agreement, and you know, I was somehow associated with that one of the things that were clear then, or as I always say, the only predictable thing in the world of services then was unpredictability itself. It's an area of the economy that's driven by technology and innovative business models, and the kind of regulatory responses that we would expect is not something that you can foresee. So the solution for that kind of future that was facing the services sector at the time was to build in a legislative function, a negotiating function that would continue to update the rules. Now, that kind of mandate of successive rounds of negotiations, we started the first round in 2000, and it got folded into the Doha round the next year, 2001. The Doha round was a project that, you know, we can talk about it for a couple of days just to unpack it and see where it went wrong. But the reality is it subjected the services negotiations to a lot of linkages. One of the most dangerous one was the linkage with agriculture, as you know. And then, as you rightly said, I mean, as of 2008, and I think the real breakdown was in July 2008, where we had the signaling conference, which was trying to rebalance the picture a bit. That breakdown of the Doha round actually was turned into an institutional breakdown, which not just affected services, but affected all other areas of negotiations, with very few exceptions, notably, of course, trade facilitation. And maybe, you know, a couple of things here and there, like the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement, and so forth. But if I may sum up all this complicated picture, we started with a very complex area of negotiations, that's services, which got really entangled with a very, very broad agenda. And as a result of an institutional challenge to the negotiating function itself in general, the services negotiations went to sleep. And this revolving mandate that we have in Article 19 actually went dormant. There was no political will really to pursue it. Now, there's another factor which I may add, and it's highly relevant to the situation we're in today, which is the unfavorable bias against plurilaterals, which is something that really, I think, has plagued the negotiations for a long time. And it's quite odd for services because in Article 19 of the GATS, which sets the scene for the negotiating function, calls upon members to engage in plurilateral negotiations because of the nature of the sector itself and the negotiating process. Now, of course, plurilateral negotiations does not mean that the outcome would be applied plurilaterally with discriminatory effect. No, It will go into schedules, and anything that is negotiated plurilaterally would be applied on a most favored nation basis and would benefit everyone, just like the domestic regulation negotiations that ended with the schedules that were certified. Here we need a little bit of thought leadership, and we need a little bit of guidance about what kind of discussions and conversations we have in the WTO, which brings us to the disappointing aspect of this ministerial, as you rightly said in the beginning, reform, and the reform needs to start with the negotiating function. I mean, I could go on for a long time, but back to you. Sorry, you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Hamid. You've given us so much food for thought already, but I was just struck by one image that came to my mind when you were speaking. The services negotiations have been lying dormant, sort of like Sleeping Beauty, for 15 years. So we need to find a way to wake them up. And that's what we'll be discussing in a minute or so. But I guess before we get there, let's go to each of these three outcomes. And you said that the one on services domestic regulation wasn't surprising because these schedules had to be certified at some point. And that is true, but I think it's very interesting that those that were blocking it chose to unblock it precisely at the moment of the ministerials to make a big splash. And that is a good thing because it does draw attention to the importance of this area. Because right now, 70 governments have signed the agreement and will eventually bring it implemented because it's been incorporated into their schedules once all of the schedules are certified. But there are 166 members of the WTO. And that means there are very many more members that haven't yet signed it. And this is a really important agreement that first and foremost benefits those that adopt it at home. So I think drawing attention to the nature of this agreement that can really result in a huge amount of benefit. I think the OECD and WTO have estimated about cost savings for services of $150 billion annually, which is tremendous, of course, overall. But none of these savings are at the, to the detriment of anyone else. There are no losers in this. It's just the removal of dead weight laws, bureaucratic inefficiencies and sort of removing huge regulatory divergences. And so, these cost savings are huge and they could benefit any member. They will benefit members that don't sign, of course, but they will benefit more those members that do sign and implement. So I think it was good to bring attention to this area through announcing it at the ministerial. So I think this is a really positive thing going forward. Hopefully we will see more signatories to this, and this is exactly the kind of plurilateral that shouldn't create any kind of difficulty whatsoever for any member. And I think that extending that, as you mentioned, the Article 19 possibility for encouraging plurilaterals precisely was taken up in the 2000s by WTO members that proposed, for example, sectoral movements on sectoral, but groups, cluster movements, which would have grouped several sectors into one sort of agreement and plurilateral agreement. And, that remains a possibility. It hasn't ever been made concrete, but it remains a possibility. So thanks. Let's move to the e-commerce moratorium. I think it's important to highlight exactly what you said. This seems to be perhaps time-bound now. So since it has been in effect 25 years, let's think about what it represents and what other elements are out there that need to complement it in a digital world in which we now live, and to clarify it, the scope of it in particular. What does it affect? So I think there is going to be another session in this series on e-commerce, so we won't go into too much depth, but what I'd like you to discuss, Hamid, is the relationship between the moratorium, which prohibits customs duties being imposed on electronically generated trade flows, either goods or services. But which one does it affect most, goods or services? Is this moratorium really a services moratorium? And if so, what's the relationship with taxing services? externally and internally. Maybe you could comment on that.
Thank you. This is one of the issues now that need proper unpacking, and now is not the time to do it in all detail, because it sort of over the past 25 years was based on perceptions that were created at times when certain things were not clear. Namely, the digital products, or so-called digital products, there was a disagreement on whether they were goods or services. That's what gave rise actually to the moratorium. Now, of course, the moratorium is very ambiguous in terms of what it covers. It says electronic transmissions. Now, there are two views there. Does that cover the content that is being transmitted, or does it cover only the carrier function, the transporting function? Now, be that as it may, the point here is that you fast forward 25 years and you look at the sort of internationally agreed classification systems that we have today. We follow the CPC, right? The Central Product Classification System of the United Nations. Now, why do we follow it in services trade? And by services trade, I don't just mean the GATS. I mean all agreements, all FTAs that cover services. They treat services as products, not as activities, not as products, right? So you fast forward, and then you see that all the digital products that created the debate that led to the moratorium in the first place, ebooks, software, music, videos, now apps, all those sort of digital products, they're now classified in the CPC, Chapter 84, as online content services. They're classified as services, right? So the moratorium is about not imposing customs duties on those products. That's for those who believe that it covers the content. Then the question is, are we talking about imposing customs duties on services? Because that is a very, very new element of discussion. It never came up during the Uruguay round or during the long negotiation and drafting of the GATS, nor actually has come up in that form ever. So are we now talking about imposing customs duties on services? Now, that's a conversation that needs to be had. And perhaps the place to discuss this is the Council for Trade and Services in the WTO, which is the body responsible for administering the GATS itself. So is this what members are talking about? So let's call things what they are. If it is about something else, then what is it? Now, back to your question about whether it affects goods or services, I think it mainly affects services, even when we're talking about trading goods. Because e-commerce is about what? It's about ordering goods online and having them delivered to your place, right? So the good itself, if it's crossing the border, would be treated as a good with customs duties applied on it. If you import a product, a toaster, it's going to come through customs, and you will pay customs duties on it. But there is a whole value chain of services involved in that transaction, from getting on your computer screen, and that's a distribution retail service, to paying for it, that's electronic payment services, to maybe paying insurance, search engine and information services, and then having it delivered to your door through express delivery services. So even when the transaction itself involves a good, the infrastructure behind that transaction is services, and what is being electronically transmitted and delivered is services. Now the good.
Excellent point, because these are embedded services, and they're embedded in everything that we produce and consume, and they're increasingly embedded in all products. And if you consume any or purchase any electronic today, the value of that electronic is the actual case, the physical case is minimal, but it's the services content that really represent the value. So if you, as you say, the good crosses the border as a computer, it's taxed as a computer, but really you're taxing the services component inside it, because that's what creates the value. And we don't have a conceptual system for that. And you're absolutely right. And I think this is one of the dilemmas that will have to be grappled with over the next 2 years. And in order to do this adequately, we have to understand this concept of embedded services and what creates real value in world trade. And that's why this trade and value added database is so important. But the concept, first and foremost, has to be understood, because when it is understood, then services represent, as we said, 50%, 55% of the value of world trade already.
Yeah.
And that is true for all of our for most of our electronic transactions. For many of them, it would go up to 80, 90% often.
Well, you look at your smartphone.
Exactly.
That tells you a big story, right?
So we need to define what this moratorium covers. You're right. And it should be discussed like that.
I think we need to revive also policy conversation about services, because services as inputs to any production activity is something that governments and policymakers need to actually remind themselves of. Whether the example that I always give is that of Egypt, my country of origin. Egypt is number 6 worldwide in producing fresh vegetables. Not many people know that, but that tremendous production capacity is never reflected in Egypt's exports of vegetables, nor is it reflected even in the domestic market. Why? Because growing tomatoes on the field is one thing and putting it on the shelf of a supermarket is another. And between A and B, there's a value chain of services. But you see, when the Egyptian government wants to promote exports of vegetables, they go to the Ministry of Agriculture. That's not the place where the problem lies. You see?
No, exactly. That's not. Yes, right. Well, that is a whole learning process, and that's why services have to be so much more at the forefront of discussion. Because, ignoring them basically means ignoring every aspect of our trade and consumption and production these days. But let us now turn to examine the paragraph on services in the ministerial declaration, because that's important. And I'd like your thoughts on that. The paragraph contains 2 areas of attention and commitment in particular. And the first is the need to facilitate the increased participation of developing members, including LDCs and global services trade. That was the same thing that was said 2 years ago at the ministerial, when there was a discussion of the waiver at that point. This time, not so much. And the second component, or the second area of attention was and this time around is the commitment to reinvigorate work on trade and services within the mandate of the GATS, including through further thematic evidence-based discussions. So this paragraph basically acknowledges that the services work in the WTO needs to be reinvigorated. So that's important. But as you said early on, this could mean many things or nothing, depending upon how WTO members decide to act upon it. So my question to you is, in your view, with your experience, how should the WTO best go, or members in the Council on Services discussion, go about this reinvigoration of services, and particularly services negotiations? What form could such an initiative take, and who could lead it? And I'd like to just prompt your reflection by pointing out once again that the GATS schedules are very outdated at this point after 30 years, that maybe a very simple way to move forward would simply be to update these schedules through binding the current commitments at the level of regulatory practice. There's been a lot of openness in services, market openness, liberalization, or if you call it a regulatory reform, since the WTO came into being, and this could be a fairly simple way of capturing the market opening that's taken place over the last 3 decades without too much pain in negotiating, and would create more certainty and predictability for services trade flows. But is this the best way? How do we go about enlarging the scope of the commitments as well?
I think I would start there by the thought that first thought I got when I read that paragraph. I was disappointed because of the absence of the N word, negotiations, right? Because the language repeats what Article 4 of the GATS says. Article 4 is about the increasing participation of developing countries, right? And giving due attention to sectors and modes of supply of export interests and all that. They're exactly the same language. But Article 4 says that the increasing participation of developing countries shall be achieved through negotiated commitments. That's how. And the logic of that is, for developing countries to have services capacity being developed domestically, they need to open up their markets. How? Through commitments. Why? Because we have the four modes of supply, most important of which, of course, is commercial presence, mode 3, which is about attracting FDI. There isn't one single developing country that I know that does not wish to attract FDI. Now, having commitments that actually create predictability and stability in your regulatory conditions is one of the most essential factors in making your market investment friendly. So that vision was there when the agreement says you increase your participation through negotiated commitments on both by all countries, not just by developed countries to open up their markets for sectors of export interest to developing countries, but for developing countries themselves to open up their own markets in order to develop their own domestic capacity. So that kind of virtuous circle is the logic on which the provision was based. So when this language was repeated here, but without mentioning negotiations, I thought that operational element is missing. It doesn't mean it's dead, but it means that somebody needs to kiss the frog to make it a prince.
Yes, it means that some WTO members need to lead.
Yeah.
In the services area. Now, one could ask, well, who should be interested in services? Well, everyone should be interested in services. That's actually, that question has an obvious answer. Every single WTO member should be interested in services. But the real question is, who will take up the mantle? Because it requires a leadership effort in order
Absolutely.
to rekindle this, particularly, as you say, to move it from a discussion basis to a negotiation basis, which is where it will make a difference. But, that's why I thought that perhaps the first and easiest step would simply be to take existing commitments, agree to bind them at the level of regulatory practice currently, which would almost not involve negotiating. What would involve negotiating would be to expand the scope and the breadth of these commitments. So that might be a second step, but getting countries, WTO members, familiar already with the idea of focusing on services and the benefits of that would be important, and making those commitments more transparent, precisely because they would be at the level of regulatory practice and legal application. I think that's what industry and the private sector is looking for: predictability, transparency, stability, to inform their investment decisions and their trade decisions. So that's really important. And I think we have maybe time for a last big question, which is not related to anything that actually was said or done at the WTO ministerial conference last week, but it's really important nonetheless, in my mind. and I like your thoughts, Hamid, and that is what would be the relationship between the ongoing e-commerce plurilateral negotiations, which are targeted to be completed this year, and the reinvigoration of work in the WTO GATS in the services area. Do you think that this reinvigoration could encompass a discussion of disciplines as well on digital trade, such as those being negotiated in the plurilateral context, or is that already being taken care of elsewhere and won't be repeated in the WTO? And if not, then where does the necessity to bring the WTO up to speed on digital disciplines for services trade in the 21st century fit into this mandate that was just given by ministers?
I think there is a big overlap between the what's going on in the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce and the GATS. There's a huge overlap, and you can take all the regulatory disciplines that are being negotiated in e-commerce now, and actually fit them under additional commitments. And I don't want to get too technical about it, but there is a room within this built-in negotiating function for the development of new regulatory disciplines, because everybody knew from the very beginning that the regulatory environment would have to evolve with technology. So there had to be a mechanism that would capture new realities and respond through updated rules. Now, there is a huge overlap. Now, what would the proponents or participants in the e-commerce negotiations want to do legally at the end of the negotiations is something that is not clear yet, because if they want to create a new standalone agreement, then they will have to see how this is going to be wired with what already exists in the WTO, not just the GATS, but also the GATT on merchandise trade, because there are aspects there that would have some bearing on merchandise trade. Now, there also you can schedule under the GATT non-tariff measures that would cover the interests that are being negotiated. So in terms of substantive and legal overlap, there's a lot of overlap. There's a fork in the road in these negotiations, whether the outcomes would take the form of improved schedules under the GATT and the GATS, which would mean MFN application, or whether they want to take it as a closed box and have a new standalone agreement, in which case they're going to have to face tremendous challenges, in my view, if they want to keep it inside the WTO. We've seen a taste of that with the investment facilitation agreement, right? So the question is, what would the participants decide to do at the end of the day? But be that as it may, there is still a long way to go under the existing system, which relates to your previous question about reinvigorating work under the GATS. Now, just clarifying the instruments that are there. Just to give you an example, one of the big issues on digital trade is cross-border data flows. Okay, can we just clarify what rules we have on cross-border data flows? If you look at the telecommunications annex, paragraph 5C, there is an obligation on WTO members to allow cross-border data flows for the purpose of supplying services listed in your schedule. Now, we can actually evolve that, expand its scope. We can look at that and respond to new realities. There's so much that can be done. There are recognition arrangements that countries can enter into consistently with the provisions of the GATS. There are instruments there which lie unused, but that relationship that you're asking the question about, I think, is going to be one of the complex agenda items to look for, and the more this reinvigoration of the agenda advances, the more this will be clear to a lot of people. And I like very much your idea about updating schedules. We tend to forget that all those schedules that came out of the Uruguay round were just token commitments. The real achievement of the Uruguay round was building the system itself. That's why we decided then that we will come back to the negotiating table 5 years later. It's very similar to what happened in agriculture. You know, we also tend to forget that we have what we call built-in agenda. Where is that?
Yes.
Right?
Well, my hope is that coming to a reinvigoration of the services agenda will not take as long as it is taken to in the discussion on agriculture. But that's my hope, my fervent hope. And I think that you're absolutely right that one of the complex questions that will need to be faced over these next 2 years before the next ministerial will be, what will be the relationship of the outcome of the e-commerce plurilateral and the actual WTO legal agreement, and how will the participants decide to take it forward, in what form, in what manner, and that decision will affect a lot the situation of other WTO members that are not participating, supposing that it would be taken as a standalone agreement. And so there are a lot of consequences, because if that's the case, then in fact there is a void in the area of these digital disciplines, disciplines on digital trade, that would then be present in the WTO itself. So, you know, we have to, there are a lot of consequences in both arenas, and I think this is something to really be terribly much focused on, because it's very important the way this will evolve and how it will affect the system. So these were my questions to you, Hamid, today. Is there anything we've forgotten to discuss?
Thank you, Sherry, and you've added a lot to the food for thought that we should be actually thinking about going forward. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thanks to everyone listening, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Same here.
Thank you, Hamid, so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye to everyone.